Hello, Marco, and welcome everyone.
Ciao,
Ciao.
Enrico.
How are
Ciao.
you doing?
Good so far. Very relaxed today.
Good stuff. Happy Friday, and good to have you with us. Welcome everyone who's watching us from whether it's afternoon, morning, evening. I'm Enrico from Avance Coperta. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome back Marco Heimeshoff to talk about domain-driven design, of course. And we are doing this live after another similar one we did 3 years ago when we launched or started talking about your workshop. And I'm very happy today to announce that we are doing this very edition of the workshop in Berlin next June. So coming to Germany again, we had a wonderful event storming masterclass workshop at the end of February with Alberto Brandolini, and we are doing another one with Marco in June. So make sure you check out the link I'll provide later on. But for now, we'll focus on a chat with Marco on DDD, CQRS, event sourcing, and everything in between as usual. Please feel free to drop your questions on the YouTube and LinkedIn chat. We're going to read them along as we go. So that's it from me, really. Marco, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Still good.
Still good. Nothing changed in the last 2 minutes.
That's fantastic. So, Marco, would you please tell us something more about this workshop? Now, it's been a couple of years we've been doing this now. It's the first time in person and even more special, as I mentioned, in Berlin. But what is it about? Let's imagine some folks have never heard about it.
Okay, so there's 2 things to this workshop. First of all, the topic itself. It's a domain-driven design workshop, combining domain-driven design as a guiding set of principles with CQRS and event sourcing architecture, which are not domain-driven design per se, but which lend really well into DDD, especially because of the semantics, right, used in event sourcing. Event sourcing being a persistence technology or method where you don't store the state of your objects in a database, but you store whatever happened in the domain verbatim. So in actual the business language or ubiquitous language, as we domain-driven designers call it. And that means when you do your modeling, right, domain-driven modeling together with the domain experts and the technical people, and you're doing something, for example, like an event storming session, you are already talking about things that are happening in the domain in past tense, and then using those events as a storage mechanism to really have the language of the business being persisted means you can not only get to the same states again that you had in code, but you can also derive new meaning from it in the future. So instead of just having a data set, let's say you have your shopping cart at a cinema, right, saying you have 5 tickets reserved, with event sourcing, you know that, hey, you've reserved a seat, you reserved another seat, you maybe ordered or didn't order. From all of these events, you can say, I want to know how many tickets have been sold for a specific seat in a cinema, regardless of the movie, for example. Right, and now you don't have to build another piece of software that starts recording these things. With event sourcing, you already have a record of everything that happened, and this is it has a lot of benefits and also some challenges, which we will go into depth with this workshop. But first and foremost, it really works well with domain-driven design because you're thinking about business language or ubiquitous language in the context that you're working in already, and then this knowledge transfers easily to these events. So this is why the combination. And CQRS, on the other hand, is an architecture pattern where you actually split your command handling models from your data representation or query answering models. So an actual responsibility segregation of data representation and behavior. This not only lets you scale your system very well because you can optimize your command handling for consistency and high throughput and having a complex domain expressed in as little code as possible while still being fully represented. And you can scale out your data just for presentation all over the world with multiple servers and in various different shapes. Even you can have third normal form databases, business intelligence, cube, any kind of graph database, whatever you like, because you can represent everything from a stream of events. That's called projecting. And these 2 architectural patterns, CQRS and event sourcing, they go really well hand in hand already, and they both work really well with domain-driven design. So all of this is a match made in heaven. And that's the one part of the workshop that I care about a lot, which I cared about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago already when I started doing these kinds of workshops. The other thing is this is the in-person edition again. So for the last, I think, ever since the pandemic, since 2020 or so, we've only been doing these remotely. And while they're still fun and we learn a lot, and there's even enough time to practice and do some co-modeling and co-coding even using screen share and other methods. But what I was missing for the last few years was the immense collaborative power that you've had when you have like 10 or 20 people in a room modeling a domain together. You get way more collaboration. There's a lot of different challenges to face, and well, we've had enough of the online versions now. I mean, we can still do more, but the in-person one gives you a completely different aspect of collaborative modeling. And then it makes it very easy to go back from modeling to code, back to model when you share the same thing in a physical space. So yeah, I'm massively looking forward to doing that again, being in actual room with actual people coding and modeling.
Absolutely, that's going to be very cool, as you mentioned, after doing so many of the remote version. I think like 7 or something around that area. Since pandemic, now we are finally meeting in a room and doing this together. Now, you gave a great overview of what we're going to do, but what I think I missed is, so who are we targeting? Who is this for exactly? So we've had, as I said, many editions, many different levels of people, but who is the ideal target for this?
Yeah, so the ideal targets are developers and senior developers and architects who want to align their business models with their code base better. So if you have a big legacy system that you want to modernize and you want to extract some features and build a clean new system, basically, this is a really good workshop for that, because from experience of the entire industry, right, a big rewrite almost never works. And I say almost just to not be sued, but it kind of never works. But with domain modeling, with domain-driven design, we can actually model the entire domain in certain bounded contexts, figure out which one of them have strategical value to be replaced or to be extracted, and then using patterns like anti-corruption layer to build a new system that we then attach to the legacy so that we can replace it step by step. And this is something that works really, really well with CQRS and event sourcing. So the whole shebang of modeling in business language in your ubiquitous, in your bounded context, and then building it with CQRS and event sourcing. If that is your challenge you're facing, these architectures and modeling methods will help a lot. Also, if you're building a new kind of system, or if you're building generally new features into your already existing system, having a clear understanding of where the boundaries are and what specific terminology and expressions mean in your context, and then having an easy way to express that in code, so that over long time of development, new developers can come into the fold, look into the source code, and already understand the business meaning of it. So building higher quality systems and making sure that it's maintainable, but also that new learnings and new understandings get reflected in source code, as well as in the models that you verbally communicate. Now that sentence kind of ended there, but I guess you know what I mean. So if you're a senior developer, architect, or a developer with a strong foundation in message-driven development, and you want to have high semantics and high alignment between your code and your model, then this workshop is for you.
That's great. Thanks, Marco. And from what you mentioned since the very beginning, of course, this one is a workshop targeted mainly at software developers, even though, of course, we are going to, look into solving the problem of communication within teams, whether it's, between software developers and all the other stakeholders, which is also one of the key points of event storming. So that's
And this is a distinction that's important to understand for this workshop. So domain-driven design is for everybody, right? If you're a product owner, if you're a developer, a tester, a designer, C-level, whatever your role is, as long as you are affected by the domain model or you have something to say about the domain model, then you can very much use domain-driven design to your advantage. Collaborative modeling methods like event storming, context mapping, any kind of activity that goes with DDD, or just the general mindset are already very helpful. But this workshop is specifically to combine the domain-driven approach of modeling and collaboration with the architecture and code patterns. So if you have nothing to do with coding or architecture, this workshop is not for you. Avans Cuperta has an executive view of DDD or an event storming workshop, but there are other workshops that cater to this. This is specifically if you want to build technology after modeling a domain. Modeling will be part of this workshop. So roughly a third of the entire workshop is how to get to a good model, how to define ubiquitous language, how to set proper boundaries in your mental models, and then how to translate this into source code and modules. This is the entire round trip, basically.
Awesome, which is also what we've read and seen with the feedback. So it was one of them. I remember going from zero to code, kind of, from the model part of it, and we cover everything here. But mainly, as Marco mentioned, mainly for developers. So I remember when we did the live 3 years ago, I already asked this question. So after these years, I want to see if it's still relevant or not. So is DDD, I remember when we did the live was 2021, we were kind of in a moment of hype of it. Is it still the same? Has it never been? What is your take on this?
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? I would like to refuse the question and ask a better one, or rephrase it. So I don't think that DDD ever had a hype, and I hope it never gets one. The moment that something gets a hype, usually a lot of people jump on the bandwagon, and then big consulting companies take over, and the whole thing goes down the drain. But domain-driven design is a guiding set of principles, right? It's not a method, or it's not a recipe of how to build systems. It's a guiding set of principles. And these principles just make a lot of sense when you build complex systems or solve problems for complex domains. And this probably will never go out of fashion, because using domain-driven design mindset means every method that makes you more driven by the domain, more aligned with your actual problem space that you're solving problems in, every method is a good method to adopt. And some things we do today that are gold standard, like event storming for modeling, domain storytelling, CQRS event sourcing, and various other methods, they are really great methods right now, but in 10 or 20 years, they might be overhauled, right? There might be something better, something more suited to the problem at hand then. That doesn't mean that domain modeling or thinking about the problems you're solving goes away. And domain-driven design as a guiding set of principles basically goes around the idea of compartmentalizing your entire business into context that you think about in isolation, refine the language, and then use whatever method helps you to build a better system that is fit for the problems you're actually solving. So that is never a hype. That is basically what object-oriented programming was all about in the 80s. And that is whatever came before that was all about in the 60s, 70s. So basically, ever since software was developed, it was about solving problems for a specific domain. And every method we came up with was trying to get better at it, or rephrasing it. And domain-driven design as an open idea or as a mindset collects all these methods and all these patterns that work really well. And it also reevaluates it all the time. Because when we say it does it, right, there is no it, there's no entity of DDD doing something. It's a living community. It's a bunch of book authors, it's a bunch of conferences, it's hundreds of professionals, or maybe even thousands of professionals who are writing blog posts and interacting. And as a learning community, this is the smartest being on the planet that actually propels this whole method forward. So no, I don't think there's a hype. I think this is just a thing that is now here to stay, because it increases quality when you're building business software.
Perfect. Of course. Thank you, Mark. It was, how to say, not, I wouldn't call it provocative, but just, to prove a point. And I think...
well, the truth is always provocative.
Well, there you go. Now, this gets me to another question, which we didn't prepare for, but I'm sure you have a good answer, which is, now, of course, we talk about a lot of jargon, or, something that if you are not into it from the get-go, you might feel lost about. So what are the biggest challenges when it comes to, say, I want to start with this? So how do you actually start if you've never heard of it, or if it's something new and even scary, I would say?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And specifically the thing that I mentioned last, right? DDD is a guiding set of principles with hundreds or thousands of people having slightly different or massively different opinions about it. How do you start in such a fuzzy field where there is no clear definition of what's in or out, because it's an open set of ideas? So I would say the first thing you could do, of course, is, besides joining the workshop, which we're talking about here, which is a great start. But besides that, if you want to learn further, any of the conferences around, right? There's Kandinsky in October in Berlin. There's DDD Europe in May, I think, in Amsterdam. There's Explore DDD next week in Denver, should you be in the US. Just go there. So any of the big conferences are a good start. There's also the virtualddd.com website. Virtual DDD is the virtual domain-driven design community. And this website, by the way, will get a revamp tomorrow, if I believe Kenny's update schedule. But there will be an update. We want more people to be able to actually participate in the community and just add their own workshops there. So it's a website where we gather all the learning materials based on your experience level. There is different guides where you can say, hey, I want to get started. Here are resources. I'm already professional. Here are great sessions to watch. And there's always a new collaboration session coming up where people meet online to work together, learn together. So those are the social ways of interacting, like conferences and virtual DDD. If you are more a book reader, I would recommend a book like Learning Domain-Driven Design by Vladi Kononov. We'll put the link into the description later. Learning Domain-Driven Design, really good and easy, digestible book that guides you through all the important things from last year, so you get a good setup for DDD. If you're already a bit more experienced, the Patterns, Practices, and Principles of DDD by Nick Tune and Scott Millett is a book that I recommend for years. It's still not outdated, so there are some modern developments that aren't in there, but it's a really good start to get hooked in domain-driven design. The original book by Eric Evans is a recommendation for people who are already deep into DDD. It has a lot of knowledge and wisdom in there, but it's hard to read, and it's now over 20 years old, so it's a bit of a hard pill to swallow when you start with that. Many people get pushed away by starting to read that because it feels very technical in the beginning. But yeah, so those are the thing that I would start with as a resource. And from a company perspective, if you want to get into domain-driven design, I've seen two things that work very well. One is if the modeling starts with for something simple like event storming. If people start to collaborate between domain experts and developers by modeling visually using sticky notes on a board and refining language before writing any kind of code, and make this a repetitive or not repetitive, make it a iterative practice. So not just one big bang modeling and then code again, but make modeling something that you actually live and breathe as a company. That is one of the simplest way to get started. And the other would be, if it comes more from the developers who want to start domain-driven design, focus on the ubiquitous language in code, right? No matter what the architecture pattern is, you don't have to start with a big cloud computing, large language model, event sourcing, like any of those things, doesn't matter. Start with value types and refine the language of the business in code. Instead of having an int, a varchar, a string, have a starting date, have an amount of euros, have the actual types of your domain being represented in code, and refine the language whenever you learn something new. Both practices will guide you to a deeper understanding and to deeper discussions about the actual domain while thinking about what you're building. And I think with this, having community, having resources, and a guiding starting principles, that might be the easiest start you can have.
Yeah, and considering what you said about the book, Eric Evans, starting point of the whole thing. Yeah. Since then, there's been, plenty of, as you said, even more conferences, remote meetups, the virtual DDD community, of course. So there's, more, I would say, easy to grasp for a beginner resources, which are not only aimed at the technical folks. So a lot has been going on, and a lot is still happening. Also, thanks to including what we are doing today and what you do, you and our experts and other experts are doing constantly, and that's great. We have resources tidied up for level of expertise on virtual DDD community. Yeah. Now, what are we actually going to do during the workshop? Let's go back to that again a bit. So as we said, so far it's been an online version of it, but we're going to be in a room with computers, I guess. And so how is that going to happen? We are there for 3 days. Lots of interaction, of course, as we mentioned, but what is it in practice? That's a question we get asked.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the first day we'll have a deep dive into what domain-driven design is and isn't, right? Talking about basically the entire scope from business strategy down to code level to tackle or to get an overview of all the things that DDD touches and changes within a company. And then we will guide the entire rest of the 2.5 days through these methods, starting from understanding a value proposition of a company, boiling down to, hey, let's do a deep dive in modeling. We'll have a practical session of event storming to get a deep understanding of a domain we're presenting, and then having various roles of stakeholders being represented in a role-playing game by all the attendees. So everybody will be a certain expert of a certain field. And then we see all these competing stakeholders and these competing interests being not actually fighting, but being helpful to actually get to a good and complex domain model. Once we have a deep enough understanding, we will use the entire model to build a bounded context map. So with a theory of what a bounded context is and how to separate them, also understanding the heuristics of, hey, there's always different kinds of boundaries you can draw. What are the trade-offs and how can we move forward with the optimal one? Is there even a thing like an optimal one, right? From a context map, we then understand the domain-driven relationships between all those different mental models that we discovered ourselves. And from there, we will go into architecture. So starting with something like hexagonal architecture, how can we actually make sure that the domain models and the part of the business we want to protect are isolated from the infrastructural parts? Having that, using the ubiquitous language in source code, so getting into the tactical patterns of DDD, what's a value type, an entity, an aggregate, repository, and all those patterns. Also hinting a little bit at functional programming, depending on whoever's in the room, right? If there is experience and curiosity about those patterns as well. And from there, we will use the last 1.5 days to build a CQRS and event source system, fully test-driven and message-driven, where we have the entire domain isolated in clear language, and then we will refactor and refine with every method we learn to go deeper and deeper to have a deep alignment between code and mental model. Since it's in a physical space, we will keep the entire domain model on the wall and also practice this effect of iterative modeling, right? So you model something with a very limited knowledge in the beginning. You take your best guess, you have a model, we decide, hey, this is what we want to build. The moment you dive deeper into code, realizing while you're programming that there is stuff missing, questions come up, new ideas pop in. But how does this change the model? We can go back to the model, refactor it, draw new boundaries, clear up the language, go back to the code, and you can see the interaction between code and practical model the entire time basically in a speed run of 3 days. So at the end, there will be an entire software built with read model, visualization, and a complex and deep domain model with behavior built with CQRS and event sourcing, representing a domain that we actually can see on the wall with sticky notes and hand-drawn boundaries. There you go.
Well, if you're into DDD, I don't know what can be, more exciting than this. So looking forward to that, because there's going to be a lot going on, definitely. One point, though, we had this also in the some parts for the online workshop. This is not a workshop to, it's not a deep dive on event storming, because that's like one of the initial parts of the workshop, which we use to, to go somewhere else, kind of thing. So just wanted to quickly point that out.
Yeah, and very important, it's not a deep dive in event storming, but no experience with event storming is required to go to this workshop. So we'll do an event storming session light with a few hours. We'll build a deep model, but we're not educating on how event storming works on a deep level. That takes, I think, 2 days or so.
Yeah,
that's a different workshop.
Exactly. So just wanted to clarify that quickly. We getting towards the end of this conversation. If any of the folks who are here with us, among them, just shout out to Kenny. It was not to see if you were watching this video, but I know he replied that he's working on the website now. Good one, Kenny.
Very good.
If any of you has questions, it's the right time to ask them. We're going towards the end of this conversation with Marco. Now, we spoke briefly about how to get started with domain-driven design. And I know we spoke briefly before this live with you about some clients you are managing. Of course, we can't mention anyone, but one of the points we get asked very often is, so how do I move to DDD? So say I read about it, everyone who's doing it is kind of, achieving great results. I want to start with that or move what I'm already doing over there. So any interesting stories here?
Yeah, a lot. So this is a kind of a broad answer, right? In the abstract form, how to move to DDDs, figure out what leverage you have in the company. So sometimes a company is entirely open to new ideas and experimenting anyway. Then you have a lot of leverage saying, hey, I found a way how we can collaborate better between business and technology. So with the knowledge you get from a workshop like this, or from a method like event storming, or anything you've read about it, start an open experiment, right? One of my key heuristics when I start with domain-driven design in companies is domain-driven design touches almost everything, from business strategy to architecture to team topologies to the system architecture you're building, even to the line of code and how you name your database tables. So everything gets affected. But don't try to make DDD an all or nothing approach. So if you try to learn everything about DDD before you actually start doing it and then do it fully, you will most likely fail because it's way too much of a change at once. Figure out where you can actually influence your company, where you have the power to do some meaningful change. If you're a programmer, change the source code, right? Build better language in the source code. Make your tests domain-driven. Have them be purely commands and events so that pure language exists in the test and no technical constructs and so on. So that would be a really good change. Then you can isolate your domain model from the infrastructure, and this will give you a lot of leverage in the future. From there, usually the next conversation with domain experts would be, hey, let's look at tests together because they're written in pure language, right? So now we can actually reason about it together and have a deeper collaboration even. Do something like pair programming or ensemble programming, get everyone in the conversation involved, even the non-developers, and make sure that the alignment is always with the domain experts, not with the technology. So let the programmers learn the business language. Don't let the business people or domain experts learn the technological concepts. That is a way to move to DDD from the programmer's fold. Another way is using collaborative modeling, whatever method you prefer, right? I totally prefer event storming, but whatever method you prefer to get domain experts and developers together in a room to build a mental model of the actual business behavior and the stakeholder needs or the user needs, and then get this aligned as much as possible with the technology based on whatever architecture works in your company. So it's a bit of an abstract answer because the answers are as varied and as complex as reality and as companies exist, right? Some companies, I mean, most companies, to be honest, still have third normal form databases and build smart UIs on top of that in large parts of the system. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you have a complex part of the domain where the behavior is really intricate and requires deep modeling, you need a clear boundary at some point, right? So finding the areas where you can break out from the treaded path you already have, building a better domain model, isolating it, making it linguistic, those things would be the to-go starting point. The hardest struggle I feel most companies have is in the entire stitch through the company hierarchy from strategic development, right? There are some C-level people deciding, hey, this company needs 2 more teams and we need to split this and build that because whatever reason, that's not my forte. Then you have product developers who know in detail what needs to happen in certain areas of the business. And you have the developers who struggle with the legacy system. And those 3 different dimensions usually are very well unaligned. So they are very misaligned. Figuring out where the biggest misalignment is and putting your lever at that fulcrum, making sure that you can have most change affected there. If you have the power, that's the most effective thing you can do. If you're lacking the power, you can only help and repair the thing that you have actual influence over. So don't overestimate and don't try to be perfect in DDD. It's an iterative learning practice. Start with whatever works. If it fails, make small controlled experiments, right? Don't just throw DDD out of the system just because it failed once. It's the same like when people say agile doesn't work for us. It's like, yeah, that whole saying, that whole expression has no meaning, right? Because it's a set of principles. There are always contexts in which it works and contexts where it doesn't work. So yeah, that would be a bit of an abstract tip for how to move to DDD.
Well, I think it's concrete enough if you kind of understand what's behind it. And I would say one of the main takeaways of DDD is it's all about kind of communication and collaboration and how to align all the people to one same goal somehow. Right. So last question, because we already know some of your suggested readings, but maybe we can refresh them later on, is about, well, your career. I don't know if we can call it career, but definitely your role as a conference organizer. We know you are one of the folks behind Kandididinsky, which is a conference happening in Berlin this year, end of October, previous year's October, right? Was it always October?
Almost always October, yeah.
Almost always October. So we as Avanscopeta were there last year, like sponsoring with the booth. So we had great fun and could connect with the European and international DDD community outside of our usual channels, let's put it this way. So what's the best moment? What are the challenges of organizing a conference like that? Last year, if I'm not wrong, we had about 250, 300 people. So kind of, a lot going on.
So yeah, there's lots of challenges when organizing a conference. Some in very surprising places. So a few years ago, when Kandinsky really took off, it's a conference that is made by the community, right? So it's always been the community members who come and speak, and also who are listening as attendees. And it was kind of our credo not to have a speakers lounge and not to have like the separation of the elite and then the sheep or something. I've seen this in other conferences, and it always feels weird. So at Kandinsky, it's like if you're a speaker, you're also an attendee. It's the same level of communication with everyone. And once it started to grow, people from all over the world handed in their abstracts. So last year or the year before, when we said, hey, we want to open up the call for papers again, we had like hundreds of papers coming in. And all of a sudden you have to make a decision from, I want to hear all of these talks, or almost all of them. And we just have like 30 slots for sessions. So we want to keep it small at 300 people. We don't want to exceed that, because I feel that conferences that get bigger tend to become more anonymous. And we really enjoy this community feeling where everybody can collaborate, work with each other. So keeping it small means it reduces the amount of slots and the amount of papers you can accept. So this is actually a struggle, because I'm basically making the program, reading through it, getting some assistance from other members, but reading through hundreds and can only select like a small portion, that's hard. The other thing is there is a shift in actually how conferences get accepted or catered to by companies and also private visitors. People tend to buy tickets later and later in the game. And I've seen other conference organizers online already complain with long blog posts why this is not good. And I'm like, yeah, well, but this is, right? So this is what happens. Can't really do anything about culture that changes. So we're not afraid that anything bad will happen. People still come, and then it's always sold out. So that's not a problem. But it feels a bit weird when you're invested in a conference and you have a hotel booked and a band booked and everything, and you're spending hundreds of hours working on it. And then it's like 2 months before, like, yeah, ticket sales would be great now. So that's something you need, well, let's say buffer from the year before is good, but also having some good nerves helps. And if you have an active, and this is what we do, right, having an active feed in the community, talking with people all the time, you know people will come. So because they're talking to you, they just didn't buy the tickets yet. But yeah, so this is also my tip for other conference organizers, right? When you feel afraid to start something, the world has changed and people are buying later and later. I don't fully understand why, but that's what we observe in all conferences. Don't be afraid. It works out.
Yeah, totally relate. Even doing like workshops and much smaller events, we've seen this tendency. So as you said, just cool down. Eventually, some will, something will happen, and hopefully more folks are coming. Thank you very much, Marco. That is it for today. Thanks everyone who joined us. So I'll quickly share the link to the June 2024 workshop we are doing in Milan, as I mentioned, in Berlin. Sorry. As I mentioned, this is the first time we do this in person as Avance Scoperta with Marco, but there's been many editions of this workshop online, so you can read the feedback. If you don't trust us, of course, you can trust other people. There's been a lot of them saying cool stuff, so hope to see you all there, and if not, somewhere around. Thank you very much. Thanks, Marco.
Ciao.
Cheers. Bye-bye.